Hello. I want today to share with you my positive voice, and in doing so, give you the opportunity to perhaps think differently about HIV. I was a teenager growing up in rural England in a fairly conservative family when this new disease, AIDS, started to be talked about in the media. But as it appeared to be affecting mostly gay men, injecting drug users, haemophiliacs, it wasn't something I really ever expected to encounter. I remember the huge attention the late Princess Diana got when she shook hands with an AIDS patient. Little did I know that less than 5 years later, I would be shaking her hand as an HIV-positive woman. I'd left home to go to university, moving away from rural life to a city, quite a big transition for me. And at university in the late 1980s, the safer sex message was there for us all to see. In fact, we were encouraged to attend a safer sex talk. I was slightly mortified that someone thought I'd gone to university to have sex. Slightly boring perhaps, but I was there to study and get a degree. But I went along, squirmed at some of the images of STIs I saw, but fundamentally took away the safer sex message to use a condom. In my final term at university, I met Ian. It wasn't a planned event. I wasn't out looking for a boyfriend. I'd actually taken myself off one night to a concert on the South Bank. Orchestra I liked was playing. I got a late ticket. In the crowd, I spotted this man and just thought, quite tasty. And a bit of chat went down, numbers were exchanged, and 2 days later he called. We had a couple of dates, but I then put him on hold as my finals were really kind of important. After the exams were over, I decided to spend the summer in London, and Ian and I started dating regularly, and a relationship developed. Inevitably, as time progressed, I figured at some point in this, we're going to want to have sex. At the time, my only concern was getting pregnant. I was newly graduated, I was about to start my career, and an unplanned pregnancy would just not have been right for me. So there was a kind of awkward conversation one night with Ian where I pointed out I wasn't taking the contraceptive pill, and if we were going to have sex, I'd like him to use a condom. I kept my fingers crossed and just hoped he'd say okay. Unfortunately, he did. Some weeks later, a condom broke. No big deal, I thought, morning after pill, I can get it sorted. 10 minutes later, he's still pacing up and down the bedroom in a quite agitated state. I reassured him again, I will get the pill, don't worry. He said, I don't care about getting you pregnant, Emma. I'm worried because I'm HIV positive. I think my first reaction was, you can't be, you look normal, which I guess just highlights how ignorant I was then about HIV. I wrongly assumed the sort of people getting it were the stick-thin, ill-looking types I'd seen on TV. And here was this fit, healthy guy in the bed next to me. My immediate reaction was panic. My limited knowledge of HIV then, you could write on a postage stamp, people die. And I genuinely thought, oh my God, is my boyfriend about to die? Next day, I left his home and went to my GP, sorted out the pill, and then said words I never expected out of my mouth. I now need to speak with you about AIDS. And the doctor looked at me kind of bemused and said, why? And I explained the night before event. She handed me a leaflet and said, well, I'm not an expert in that area of medicine, so I suggest you call this helpline. The phone call was duly made, and the person I spoke to probably initially saved my life, calmed me down, reassured me my boyfriend would not drop dead straight away, which had been my biggest fear. But then informed me, because the condom had broken, there was a very small risk I might have been infected myself. I actually started laughing, thinking, no, come on, that's ridiculous. Don't you have to have had sex hundreds of times to catch it? No, she said, there's a very small risk as you've come into contact with bodily fluids capable of transmitting HIV. I said, well, what do I do? She said, well, nothing. You can take a test for peace of mind, but that will need 3 months waiting. I said, why? Are the waiting lists that long? She said, no. It takes up to 12 weeks for the antibodies to show up on a test. So Give us a call in 12 weeks, we'll set you up with a clinic appointment. I got to week 11, a little impatient, decided to go ahead and get tested. And on September the 11th, 1991, an entry in my journal reads, "Time to accept, the result is positive." That was the day that I realized that HIV did not discriminate. It wasn't about particular risk groups. It had the potential to impact on any sexually active person, and that now included me. 24 hours later, I met with a consultant for the first time. And he told me lots of information during that meeting, but the only thing I remember is him saying, if you're lucky, you might live 8 to 10 years with this disease. I remember thinking, well, that's not a good innings. I was 22 at that point. If I get the short straw, I only make it to 30. And as I left the hospital, I decided I would live beyond the 10-year mark the doctor had given me. And sometimes in life, when you're faced with a difficult situation and you don't know how you're going to carry on, it's good to set yourself a target. Have something you can aim for. So I said, I will live beyond the 10-year mark. I recognized very quickly, of course, that life with HIV was not going to be a walk in the park. It was one emotional roller coaster from day one. And I knew that when I hit those tough moments, I might find myself thinking, is there any point to life? How do I get through this? So I decided I needed something to cling on to in those tough times. Many people have their faith they can fall back on, but I don't have that. I am, however, hugely passionate about football and music, so I made little notes to myself. Must not die till England win a World Cup again. I guess based on our current performances, I'm immortal. And on the music front, I'm a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen, and I found myself saying, must not die till Bruce stops touring. Fortunately for me, he still gets the guitar out now and again, and I have been able to see him 69 times in concert. I give him a little credit for keeping me here. But in the beginning, the thought of living a week, a month, a year really didn't figure in my imagination. Because, of course, the early 1990s was a period when deaths from AIDS were rife. 1995, 4 years into my diagnosis, was actually the peak of AIDS-related deaths. And I had very much bought into the mentality of HIV equals AIDS equals death. Many of the young people I'd become friends with in my support groups were dying. Less than 2 years after my own diagnosis, Ian had died of an AIDS-related illness. I'd actually stayed in the relationship with him, and many people are often surprised that I did. But at the time, I was in love. I knew no one else with HIV. And I very much found myself thinking, if I end the relationship with him, I'm going to be single and HIV positive, and I will never find another partner. After Ian's death, I threw myself into work. I forged a career in local government, working my way up the ladders of housing and social services. And I survived to reach the 10th anniversary. I had planned on that day to celebrate my survival, but falling as it did on 9/11/2001, the day of the terrorist attacks in America, it felt slightly inappropriate to crack open the champagne and go, isn't it great to be alive, as many thousands were being killed and injured. What 9/11/2001 did, however, make me think is that, again, life can change in an instant. And I decided that although my career was going well, it wasn't my passion. And whatever time I had left, because any time after the 10th anniversary I consider bonus time, I wanted to spend it doing something worthwhile. And over that first decade of life with HIV, I'd seen the amount of stigma, the amount of discrimination, the lack of tolerance that existed. And I felt I could do something by speaking publicly about being HIV positive. Having now survived more than half my life as a woman with HIV, I have seen huge advances. Massive changes have occurred. For instance, we now know if an HIV-positive woman takes antiretroviral drugs through her pregnancy, she cannot transmit the virus to her unborn child. So in fact, here in the UK, we have a mother-to-child transmission rate of less than 0.5%. We now, in fact, have drugs that can prevent HIV transmission. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, is a tablet you can take that will stop you getting HIV. And perhaps the most important advancement for me as an HIV-positive woman is we now know that if someone who's HIV positive is taking antiretroviral drugs, something called the viral load gets reduced to undetectable levels. And if you're undetectable, you can no longer transmit HIV. Undetectable equals untransmittable. And that allows me, as an HIV-positive woman, to be engaged to an HIV-negative man, and my fiancé is at no risk of contracting the virus through having unprotected sex with me. Massive, massive change. One would hope, with all these advances in the research, the science, the knowledge around HIV, that that would filter through to the general population, and some of that stigma and discrimination would lessen. But sadly, we still see many people's attitudes stuck back in the 1980s. Just a few examples of what I have experienced. I was in a school staff room after a lecture once, shaken hands with a number of members of staff. One tutor said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Cole, I wasn't able to hear your talk. What was it on?" I said, "Oh, I spoke about living with HIV." I could see the fear descend in his face, and his first words were, "Oh my God, and I've shaken your hand. Is that okay?" Part of me wanted to say, "No, go and amputate," but I thought that would probably just add to the anxiety. I've had to deal with people's judgments. I've been told this HIV is, that my HIV was due to my promiscuous lifestyle. I've been told that it's God's punishment on me for having chosen to have sex before marriage. And perhaps the one that I will never forget was another guest in a school who said I was evil and I shouldn't be allowed near young people. And there's one final one that I will share. After surviving the first decade, I'd started to do some public speaking, and a TV producer got to hear about me. And he asked if I'd like to be in a BBC documentary he was making on positive women. I thought, what a great opportunity to reach a wider audience. This was long before TED existed. And I spoke with some members of my close family and said, "Are you okay with this?" Largely, everyone said, "Go for it. If you feel you can, do it." However, one member of my close family said, "If you go ahead and make the programme, that's the last you'll ever hear from me." I made the programme. It was broadcast 17 years ago, and from that day until today, I've had no contact ever since with that person. Even a few years ago, when I got very sick, I was lying in a hospital bed, I had oxygen masks, I had drips in both arms, pumping me full of antibiotics to fight off pneumonia. Even when I thought I might not make it, that person couldn't pick up the phone. So sadly, I've had to accept I've lost some very significant person from my life because of HIV. And I know the only way to stop that reaction happening for another person who's HIV positive is to educate people. And I made that decision as a newly diagnosed woman in 1991 to speak out publicly, and I continue to do that today as a long-term survivor. Because I know there are people being diagnosed with HIV every day, both in this country and around the world. Newly diagnosed people, those living with HIV the last 5, 10, 15 years, will have a very different experience. Thankfully, actually, hopefully, a better experience. But long-term survivors like myself, I don't want us to be forgotten. So I continue to speak out and educate another generation about HIV. In conclusion, what I hope from my talk is that if anyone were to share with you that they were HIV positive, I hope your reaction wouldn't be to cut them out of your life and have nothing more to do with them, but you can offer them friendship, support, and love without fear. Thank you.